Welcome to Arthurian April Day 14, and today we're covering Sir Palamedes. You may have recalled that in previous posts I talked about Sir Palamedes and his unique place in terms of his relation to the questing beast. But Palamedes is a whole lot more than his relationship to my favorite Arthurian monster. In fact, if I had gone on to my PhD in medieval literature, I totally would have written about Sir Palamedes, so he's a very special place in my heart. So once again, we must return to the prose Tristan, which is a 13th century manuscript, and in that is our first introduction to Sir Palamedes. In the prose Tristan, Palamedes, or Palamedes, if you prefer that pronunciation, I like Palamedes, shows up as Tristan's foil. And a foil, in simple terms, is just a person who happens to be the obstacle between what Tristan wants, which is Isolde, and getting it. There is a tournament, and Palamedes and Tristan are both battling for Isolde's attention, her hand in marriage, which later turns out far more complicated, and Palamedes does not win. But Palamedes is clearly still in love with Isolde. What makes this even more interesting is that Palamedes is, as described in many of the texts, a Saracen, or a pagan. Let's just say, even though he is a person who is from the Middle East, we don't always get a lot of details because details were not the strong suit at this point. Now, this is in direct conversation with what is happening in the 13th century. So starting in the 12th century, we have the Crusades. And for the first time, we really have massive amounts of people in the West encountering people in the Middle East and coming back home and telling these stories and trying to make sense of this world where not everybody is a Christian. Palamedes has a long, drawn-out story between him, his adventures, and eventually converting to Christianity. But it's not just Palamedes. Palamedes, by the time Sir Thomas Malory gets around, actually has a whole family. You have his father, King Excalibur, you have his brothers, Saphir and Segwarides. So there's definitely a desire to sort of flesh out these characters, despite the fact that they're very othered in the texts. Palamedes also has his own romance, but that's a little bit deceiving. So Palamedes is a romance from around the 13th century as well, and even though his name is the title, it's not all about him. It sounds like the plan was to write 3 parts of the story that include the characters that sort of before the generation that we know of Arthur and all of them, and then Palamedes' story, and then the Grail quest. If those manuscripts exist, we've never found them. So for now, despite the fact that the book is titled Palamedes, we don't see a whole lot of him in those stories. What's cool about Palamedes is that he is continually set up as a near equal to Tristan. So despite the fact that he is not a white Christian and he does not adhere to the same necessary rules that everyone else does and doesn't have the same cultural touch points, he's still incredibly skilled at what he does. He has a very fascinating storyline, and he's not treated like a buffoon or someone to make fun of. I've always seen this as a direct response to the way that Salah al-Din, who was one of the major generals in the Crusades, and the reception of him to the Western audience. Now, Salah al-Din was of Kurdish descent, but he was highly involved in the Third Crusade and had all kinds of battles at the very end of the 12th century that, were so challenging for the Western audience, the Western mindset, because he was in many ways embodying the chivalric ideal. Most importantly, he retook Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187, which was a massive turning point in the Third Crusade. In fact, and let me tell you, there's a whole lot about Salah al-Din if you're interested in reading about him. There's many interesting facts. But the one that always stuck with me was that when he finally recaptured Jerusalem, he essentially made it so that all the Franks that were living there, who had been there for quite some time, there was a ransom for them to leave that they had to pay in order to just get out of Dodge. And in many cases, he actually let them pass because if they didn't have the money to leave, he just let them go. Salah al-Din, for obvious reasons, became kind of a popular figure, and it's not surprising to me that the character of Palamedes is both faulted but also taken seriously and has a remarkable chivalric kind of procession of his work. Now, if you think that this was just unique to this time period, let me tell you, it's not, because you actually see similar themes of characters from other lands, of other races, of other traditions, in more of the Arthurian legend, but also in the Carolingian stories, which are the Charlemagne stories that predate everything that we see in the 12th and 13th centuries. In fact, there is a character in the Carolingian romances named Otwell, and he has almost the same exact kind of predicament. Charlemagne asks him to convert to Christianity. He comes from a faraway land in order to marry his daughter, and he doesn't want to do that, and that's part of the conflict in the story. Something I tend to get up on my high horse about is that the Middle Ages, while they were very problematic in a lot of ways, were still much more diverse, much more international than people really give it credit for. We know that the Danes and the Swedish Vikings, for lack of a better term, were trading with the Middle East in the 9th century. The archaeological record supports that. So it is not surprising to me that hundreds of years later, this is being codified into the larger story of King Arthur. Personally, my Palamedes is Gawain's best friend in the world, and they have done the war circuit together. They confide in each other. In fact, in many ways, Palamedes is even closer to Gawain than his brothers. He's a little bit older than Gawain, but he definitely acts like he's older and he's wiser. He's also a wonderful friend to Huifar. He's one of the only people that when she is sort of living her libertine life, he sees her beyond her reputation. But that is not entirely the end. I won't give it away entirely, and certainly in the third book, you see Palamedes again, but my hope is that someday in the future, I'll be able to sit down and write my take on the story of Palamedes.